Hey, this is Mark from TechStrats.com. Today I'm going to show you how to install Windows XP in a virtual machine using VMware Workstation. VMware Workstation is a virtualization tool that allows you to run practically an operating system within an operating system. So let's take a look at some of these options that we have to us. The typical file edit, view, VM, team, Windows, blah, blah, blah. The most important ones are actually going to rely underneath this, the power off, the pause or suspend, and the power on. And there's also reset, which is similar to the reboot on your computer. Take snapshots. What snapshots are basically just pictures of the operating system. So what you can do is take a snapshot and have that be the parent snapshot of your hard drive or whatever, and then go ahead and try to install something on your computer, and say if you don't want it, just revert back to the parent snapshot or to the previous snapshot or a snapshot that you created before at some point in time. It's actually a very handy tool when you're diagnosing problems, analyzing malware, for instance, is what it's most commonly used for, I think. I'm not actually sure. I don't know that many malware researchers as opposed to people who test usability problems in Windows and other operating systems. But all the other ones here are basically just different settings, so you can full screen Unity mode. It's something that VMware came out with. I actually use Unity mode a lot on VMware Fusion for the Mac. It makes it so that the software you're running in Windows XP in a virtual machine basically runs fluently side by side with no window basically in Windows 7. So if you were running, say for instance, some sort of flavor of Linux, you could run a program that actually looks like it's running genuinely inside Windows 7. It's actually a pretty sweet feature, and hopefully, like, the only reason I actually use it for is on the Mac. I use Word, which is virtualized in Windows. I know there's a Microsoft Word version for the Mac, but I'm cheap and it was well worth it to pay for the Fusion for VMware. Anyway, so you can also do recordings in your virtual machine, or you could replay the recordings and all that stuff. But let's dive into it and let's get XP installed. So we're going to go ahead and choose new virtual machine. We're going to do custom so I can show you the majority of the options. This is relatively similar to installing XP on your hard drive, except that VMware actually packages most of the stuff, so you don't have to do a really good majority of the settings when it comes to installing Windows XP. It basically just skips over them, and it's almost a seamless installation. As a matter of fact, if you put in the product key when VMware asks you to, it will be a seamless installation, and you can literally walk away and go make a cup of coffee or something. So let's go ahead and hit next. Hardware compatibility, we're going to do Workstation 6.5. Compatible with ESX server. This is awesome if you're into server virtualization. You can literally take a VM from a server and load it onto an OS or a desktop or whatever, and vice versa. You can pre-configure your virtual machine on your desktop and then load it onto an ESX server, and there's literally no complaints or fusses about it that I've ran into yet. So I'll go ahead and hit next. Basically, we've got a couple options to load here. If you have the Windows XP installed disk, that would be okay. I found it to be a lot faster actually ripping the XP installation to an ISO file and then using that ISO file to load into the virtual machine. So I already have mine set here, and we'll just go ahead and click next. You also have the option that you can install the operating system later. It'll just create like a blank hard drive. That's useful for some situations, but none that I've found of use for right now. Okay, so on this screen, after we hit next, it's going to ask you for the Windows product key. You can go ahead and put this in now, and it literally will install XP seamlessly, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it blank just so you get the gist of what happens when you do. The only thing that's required is the actual full name, so I'm just going to put TechStrats in here, and then the password is optional with XPSP3. I don't think it's required. You can still leave it blank. With Windows 7, it's a little bit different because they actually do require that you have a password and a password hint and all that nonsense. So we'll go ahead and hit next. And it gives us a warning saying we didn't enter a product key, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. Okay, so on this screen, it's going to ask you what you want the virtual machine name to be. You can go ahead and give it anything you want. I'm just going to call mine XP SP3. And the location, it's going to give you like a default location that's basically C:/ users, blah, 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 my documents, blah, 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 or whatever. What I usually do, because I find myself in the situation that I'm running multiple virtual machines, I usually end up putting a secondary hard drive in my computer so that it doesn't take up space away from my original hard drive, especially because I have a solid state drive, and while I would absolutely love the performance aspect of it, I really don't have enough space to be toying around with all this data, so I put it on a secondary hard drive in my computer. Okay. Then it's going to ask you the number of processors you want, the number of cores per processor. I have a pretty beastly machine, but I still only use probably one processor and one core processor for Windows XP. The hardware requirements really aren't that needy, so you can probably just leave it like that. On the next screen, you'll see similarly it asks you how much memory you want. I have never had a situation where I was using more than 512 megs. If it does become the case where you need more RAM, you can always go into the settings later and add more, up the RAM a little bit, which makes it very handy. I did a while ago decide to be, I don't know, kind of curious and run Premiere inside a virtual machine, and I don't recommend anybody for the life of themselves doing it. Although on Windows it seems to be sluggish, but on a Mac it seems to be actually rather smooth. Anyway, so go ahead and next. It's going to give you some options for network connections. Well, the default is probably the one that we want, the host-only networking. As you can see, connect the guest operating system to a private virtual network on the host computer. That basically means that your computer is technically the router for that machine. So you're getting a 192, but you really don't have an internet connection out to the world, so to speak. And then bridge networking, of course, bridges the host and the virtual machine together. And then do not use a network connection, obviously, if you're not trying to get out to the world, such as, you know, the fact if you're analyzing malware or something like that, or something you don't want to leak out onto the internet or your home network even. So we'll just go ahead and hit next, and we'll use NAT. And then for the SCSI controller, it really depends on what you're doing here. The servers that I usually run, I'm usually running the SLI Logic SAS, the SAS drives, because that's what I actually run on my servers. But for home usage, the bus logic is absolutely fine. There's no reason to just do the regular SLI logic. In fact, if you leave it with bus logic, you're going to see a performance increase with things like XP and maybe Vista. I think Vista is where they changed the controller settings a little bit, and you might get a bigger performance out of SLI logic, but none that you'll be able to pinpoint a difference in. So we'll just go ahead and hit next. And it's going to ask us if we want to create a new virtual disk or use an existing one. I'm going to create a new one. It gives you the option down here for physical disk. If you had like an internal hard drive of some sort and you had it partitioned, say 3 or 4 partitions, you could actually use that physical disk to run your virtual machine in. So you don't have to use like a virtual disk. You can actually use a hard disk or a partition of the hard disk, which is a very nice option as well. But again, you won't really see the performance increase. I mean, I have no problems whatsoever running this stuff in a virtual disk. And virtual disk type, it's going to give you the option IDE SCSI. Obviously, SCSI is going to give a little bit more performance, and it's going to provide a little bit more redundancy. You won't really see it with the virtual disks, but the option is there. I always recommend going SCSI over IDE. So maximum disk size, again, for Windows XP, I usually stick with around 40. It gives you an option basically saying if you want to allocate all this disk space. What that means is basically reserving all 40 gigs now. So the smart idea is actually to bump this up to about 80. If you have a 100 gig hard drive, I wouldn't do 80 gigs. I'd probably leave it at 40. But if you have like a terabyte hard drive, I'd bump this up to about 100 gigs and let the VMware basically decide how much space it should take. So ultimately, if you're running an operating system that's only using 8 gigs, you're only going to use 8 gigs. It's just the hard drive is actually reserved for 100 gigs, say, if you set that limit. So we'll just leave this as 40 gigs for this example. It's also giving you the option to store the virtual disk as a single file or split the virtual disk into multiple files. It says that it makes it easier to move the virtual machine to another computer, but obviously that's not the case. From what I found out, if you really split the virtual disk into multiple files, your odds of corrupting the disk and playing with a bunch of files becomes a lot greater than if you had the single file. And it even says here, you know, that the computer may reduce performance with very large disks. So I usually store it as a single file. It's up to you if you want to do multiple files. It may be easier to do multiple files. I don't really know. I'm just keen on performance, so I'm going to hit next and store them as a single file. 140 by, okay, yep, that's going to say we're going to create this here. I'm going to browse for the location and make sure that it's in the right one because I don't exactly know where this is going. It's not really telling me anything. And finally, it says it's ready to create the virtual machine. So, and then it's checked the power on virtual machine after creation, which of course we'd want. Okay, so it's going through its little Windows setup. Everything is going through automatically. You'll even see a pop-up that says easy install is installing Windows XP Professional. Hooray! I don't know why it happens, but this thing will automatically adjust my screen 50,000 times, so it's going to start clipping. Okay, so here's the part where it's just popping up to ask me for the product key. I'm going to go ahead and type this in now and hit next, and the rest of the installation will be seamless. Okay, so for now, after putting in the CD key, everything should be installed correctly. One thing that you do want to take notice of is this little VM icon down here in the bottom right hand corner. This is VMware Tools that allows you to seamlessly go back and forth between your host desktop to the virtual desktop. Otherwise, you'd have to press like Control-Alt to toggle in and out. So if it doesn't get installed and you don't see and you don't have any mouse movements except for in the virtual machine, you want to hit Control-Alt. That'll bring the mouse back to your computer instead of within the virtual machine. And then you can go ahead and go up to VM, I think it is. And mine says reinstall VMware Tools, but yours should say install VMware Tools. Sometimes this actually happens more in particular on the server installs than it does on the Windows installs because VMware must recognize that Windows is the desktop platform, automatically installs it. Maybe it's a scripting issue, whatever, I don't know. So anyway, from this point in time, you should be all set to go. That was installing Windows XP 3. The only thing I do recommend is changing the damn screen resolution because this is huge, at least on my desktop, but I can't exactly do that with the screen size I'm working with to record. So I'm going to go ahead and make some adjustments, and you can go ahead and fool around with it and see how you like it.